So I don't see Trump as like a radical in his views. I think he's much more consistent with American traditions.
Because if we look into the Trump 1.0 declassified Indo-Pacific strategy, there was a clear realization that the threat and the challenge to U.S. interests in the long term does not come from Russia, does not come from Iran or North Korea, it comes from China.
How do you make sense of the US strategic ambiguity on Taiwan? I mean, where do you think the red lines are?
The U.S. hasn't won a war since World War II. Okay, so I don't like. I have trouble understanding why so many countries think the U.S. Is this incredibly capable country.
If China becomes successful in breaking through Taiwan, then eventually it would become more complicated for the Philippines to secure our other maritime zones. And this is an inevitable consequence.
समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया.
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
अब समझा.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Where is the security of the Indo-Pacific and its contested sub-region, the South China Sea? Especially after Donald Trump 2.0 has been destabilizing America's rivals and allies alike. Now, it's true that despite mixed signals from China in the first few months, US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth recently made a tour to the Indo-Pacific region, underscoring US commitments amid the looming narrative of strategic ambiguity. Now, on the one hand, the US has been bolstering its force posture to counter growing challenges from China through naval deployments and air asset movements, such as at the Diego Garcia, etc. And at the heart of this is perhaps the US alliances with Japan, with South Korea, and Philippines, apart from the Quad framework and other alliances. But the big question is, will that be enough to deter an increasingly aggressive China in the region? Does the takeover of Taiwan, either by an invasion or a blockade, only a matter of when and not if? What has been the role of the gray zone in the worsening of these tensions? For the record, China has continuously been prodding Taiwan with 1,739 incidents recorded in 2024 alone. Now, allies of the US seem unsure and have been militarizing in their individual capabilities too. Most countries in the region have significantly enhanced defense budgets after the Ukraine war. But again, will that be enough? And what is the role of India in this great power contestation? To unpack this and more from a strategic perspective, I have two distinguished experts. First is Dr. Robert Eldridge, formerly with the US Department of Defense, the Marine Corps, and a widely published author and respected scholar on the region. Now, he has served as advisor to several key government officers across Japan, Taiwan, and the US, and he's also a recipient of several honors and awards. I'm also very pleased to welcome my dear friend, colleague, and a scholar of formidable repute, Mr. Don McLain Gill, who is joining us from Manila, Philippines. Don teaches at the Department of International Studies at the De La Salle University in Manila and is the author of numerous research papers and columns. Don is well known in the Indian strategic circles, and his analyses have won him applause from researchers and peers alike. I'm very pleased to welcome both of you to Worldview with Swasti for joining me today from strategic locations in the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Eldridge from Japan and Dr. McLain Gill from Manila, Philippines. So let me start with you, Robert. You have a very illustrious CV. I mean, you have written so many books, and you have also served at the Department of State, the US Marine Corps, and you are an intellectual, of course. You're based out of Japan right now. Now, if you just see how how these regions have been militarizing. So, Japan itself has, its defense budget now going up to 55.9 billion US dollars. Taiwan is now at 20 billion US dollars when it comes to its defense budget. Philippines has also hiked its defense budget more than 12.3%. And then comes Donald Trump. Now, in this situation where Donald Trump is trying to put America first, where do you see the security situation going in the Indo-Pacific region? I'll start with you, Robert.
Mm. Well, thank you for having me, having us. I look forward to the discussion. So, in your introductory remarks, you mentioned three important countries, democracies that have unfortunately had to devote more of their economic resources to building up their defense capabilities, not their offensive capabilities, but their defensive capabilities. And the reason behind that is not, uh, is not without a particular reason, and that's China. China's enormous, rapid militarization, particularly over the past 30 years, has necessitated the countries in the region to, either build or rebuild their militaries at an increasingly, strong pace. So, with the end of the Cold War, most countries wanted to enjoy the benefits of, a peaceful 21st century, and unfortunately, they're not able to enjoy that. Donald Trump, if most people unfortunately haven't read anything that he has written, he's written close to 20 books, and throughout almost all of his books, uh, starting from the 1980s until recent years, his theme is the same, that the U.S., should really focus on rebuilding its economy, and by doing that, it can be a responsible, respected, member of international society. And countries around the world want a strong America, I believe. And America can't be strong when it's wasting its money in fruitless endeavors, and and misspending its money. So Trump's idea of America first is to rebuild its economy so that it can be a reliable and dependable country in the world. So his demand over the years has been that countries need to be more responsible for their own defenses. So the regional trends, I think, are matching the bilateral necessities uh, of a Trump, or I would say of a Republican administration. His ideas are not new, um, both from his own background and standpoint, but also from, if you look at post-war America and certain Republican administrations, the Eisenhower administration also stressed that uh, allies need to be more responsible for their own defense. So that was the whole philosophy behind the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. You could also argue that was very much what President Nixon had in mind in the very late 1960s into the early 70s, that the allies, the individual countries, need to be responsible for you know, their own defenses. And then at a larger level, uh, at a nuclear level, the U.S. would be able to help. But at a conventional level, it's up to the individual countries. So I don't see Trump as like a radical in his views. I think he's much more consistent with American traditions. Um, and so I think countries need to understand that a little bit better, and also to step up to the plate that he's been calling for.
So, if I get your argument right, I think your central argument is that as long as the allies are also doing enough for their own security in a way that doesn't make the United States feel that they are freeloading, the United States is there to provide the big umbrella, which is the nuclear umbrella. Right. Well, that's an interesting point, and I think that's what most of the U.S. allies are forced to do. And many a times, here we have discussed this as the Trump pill, which is painful in the short term, but is going to be beneficial in the long term. But let me come to Don. Don, you are in Manila, right? And Philippines is at the forefront, is one of the flashpoints, in fact, okay, of how the US-China great power contestation is unfolding or will unfold. But help me understand that when Donald Trump has now become president again, he has been sending mixed signals to its allies and its rivals. In fact, he has gone down very, very harshly on its allies. In fact, he has cozied up to its rivals. I mean, just look at the way he has completely turned the picture around when it comes to Russia-Ukraine war, and the way he's sort of now it seems as if Putin has Donald Trump's back, and it's not gone down well, for Europeans, and there is another kind of theatrics which is unfolding there. But when it comes to your part of the world, which is Philippines, which is how Philippines has also been modernizing, etc. Help me understand, what is the sense there? Is there a sense of of urgency, of trying to ramp up on their military capabilities, or is there still a sense that Donald Trump is going to be consistent with the policy that Dr. Eldridge was just talking about?
Thank you very much, Swasti, and it's absolutely wonderful to again join Dr. Eldridge in this discussion. You talk about a very important question. One thing that I have been actually talking about since 2024 was that, during the election period in the United States, the campaign period, there were, of course, concerns in Manila whether the United States will be able to continue with security commitments for the Philippines, and, of course, the overarching alliance network in the Western Pacific. Now, I only had one simple answer to this, and I said that it was, of course, in the best interest of the United States, especially under Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, to maintain strong and robust cooperation with the Philippines and other like minded countries in the Indo Pacific. Because if we look into the Trump 1.0 declassified Indo Pacific strategy, there was a clear realization that the threat and the challenge to U.S. interests in the long term does not come from Russia, does not come from Iran or North Korea, it comes from China. And I think that there is that clear recognition under the Trump administration, both 1.0 and 2.0, that it is in fact China that serves as a long term threat to U.S. national interest. And of course, there are also concerns, or there used to be concerns, whether under Trump 2.0, that the idea of making a deal at the expense of the interests of key allies such as the Philippines would come into play. And of course, many of the detractors sort of cite the so-called agreement, or not the agreement, but more of the negotiations that Trump 1.0 did directly with Kim Jong Un, bypassing South Korean government. But then again, where is that agreement right now? And this goes to show that, of course, one point is that Xi Jinping is not Kim Jong Un, and Xi Jinping's interests are far vast compared to that of Kim Jong Un's, if you think about it that way. And second, of course, is that China was already increasing its maritime presence across island chain, because there would come a time where a sort of deal was to be made that China would want to have the upper hand in this situation. And of course, if we look into the art of the deal of President would clearly want to be in a position of dominance and strength in making these agreements. And of course, this sort of deal is not really possible when you're dealing with a major expansionist power that has little regard for the rules based order, such as China. So clearly, the next step would be to invest in like minded countries and allies that would be willing to punch above their weight in order to not only complement U.S. national interests, but would also play a part as a stabilizing force in the region. And of course, under President Marcos Jr., the Philippines has been doing exactly that. While we are aware of our lack of material capabilities to stand on our own against China, we have been doing a lot of important measures from pursuing national legislative frameworks to center on our capabilities to defend what is rightfully ours based on international law, and of course, pursuing a more revitalized Philippine military and Coast Guard modernization program under the Horizon 3.
Mhm.
Coast Guard in Southeast Asia are planning to acquire, and rather the acquisition process is already in place, 3 Coast Guard vessels in the next few years. Shows, of course, the commitment that the Philippines has towards its defense. But of course, there is a practical recognition that we would not be able to do this on our own.
Right. So, I mean, I
And
do get a sense
clearly,
that.
first come is, of course, the traditional alliance that we have with the United States, our security operation within the existing hub and spokes network, particularly with Japan and Australia, U.S. national interest, the America First perspective, but it also complements ours. And the many very disinformation campaigns that have been proliferating in Manila, as you know, the midterm elections are close and right by the corner, is that the Philippines is willingly serving as a proxy. This is not the case. The agency, the factor of agency is very much ingrained in Philippine foreign policy today. But it is equally beneficial to us of the threats that we consider as threats. And what we consider as a threat right now is not just ordinary, it is existential. And this is what I think serves as a unifying factor between the Philippines and the United States.
Right, right. No, I do get a sense of why Philippines must have an agency. I mean, I think often sitting in India, we are way too, preoccupied with the great power contestation, and everybody in the background becomes sort of, starts to lack agency, and this should not be the case. I completely agree with you on that. But if I were to pick your brains, both of yours, of course, I'm going to go to Robert first. Robert, help me understand. Um, how do you make sense of the US strategic ambiguity on Taiwan? I mean, where do you think the red lines are? Do you think that those red lines will be crossed when China imposes an A280, an anti access area denial, for the US or its allies? Or do you think there will be a full fledged invasion? Where do you think this red line is going to be crossed enough that United States responds?
Oh, we've already crossed that situation. The problem is not if the U.S. is going to respond,
Mhm.
but
Okay.
uh, if the U.S. is capable of responding. So
Hmm.
it's not a political will issue anymore.
Hmm.
It's a capability issue,
Hmm.
and the U.S. has surrendered that capability. We've lost the capability, and
Okay.
so uh, I spent the past year in Taiwan. I've spent the past 35 years in Japan. Um, particularly in Japan, but also in Taiwan, there's always this question is, will the US be there for us?
Hmm.
And that's becoming increasingly heard. But I try to tell the audiences I'm with, unfortunately, it's not a question of the willpower anymore. It's a question of whether the US has the capability anymore. And I'm unfortunately in the camp that the US has lost the capability. to respond. And I could go on for an hour or two about the weaknesses that exist in the U.S. Military, as
But
well as
Robert, if I were to just ask you, here for the benefit of the audiences, because you are a specialist with enough experience both in the American theater, the Japanese theater, the Taiwanese theater, etc. Please help us understand what those limitations are, because I think we do not really have a full-fledged, or maybe say a genuine understanding on what really are the limitations on US capabilities.
okay, there's part of part of the discussion would have to focus on the limitations in U.S. strategy, in the quality of the military right now, the quality of the equipment, um, a national hubris or arrogance that exists, that we still look down on other countries, whether they're allies or enemies. And
Mhm.
so we still think that we are, um, the best, that our operational plans are going to be successful, and that those of the enemy are going to be unsuccessful because they're underdeveloped or they lack experience or this or that. So it's a mindset, it's an quality of the institution matter. Um, Probably no one that is discussing these issues has even read Secretary of Defense Hegseth's most recent book,
Mhm.
The War on the Warriors. And he talks about the hollowing out of the US military and the uh, ideological attack on the institution. So, when we talk about US capabilities, I think we're still thinking of a strong United States, a strong economy, a strong military, the best equipment, that everything's going to function beautifully. The U.S. hasn't won a war since World War II. Okay, so um, I don't like. I have trouble understanding why so many countries think the U.S. Is this incredibly capable country. Maybe relatively speaking, yes, but if we're so capable, we would have won every war. Uh, and it's not just a question of the war fighter; it's the political leadership, and that gets back to like why Trump is so uh, passionate about rebuilding the country, because he knows where the weaknesses and vulnerabilities lie. And particularly in this administration, as Don alluded to, Trump too, he's really picked some very good people to head the respective, agencies and departments, and their main focus is on rebuilding and not overly committing right now. So going back to Taiwan, the U.S. is not in a situation where it can really respond to a Chinese attack on Taiwan right now. Unfortunately, it
Okay.
will certainly need Taiwan to step up to the plate, but Taiwan has its own massive vulnerabilities,
Right.
and I could go on and on about those. Um, Japan has a lot of weaknesses. Again, a lot of it is on the political side, on the decision making side. Currently, you have an administration in Japan that is essentially captured by China, the so-called elite capture. Most of them are very close with China. Um, there's a lot of concerns that China might act when the current administration is, leaning towards China or beholden to China. So there's just so many problems in the alliances that exist right now, and that's why the training and the joint operations and the shared basing and all that is so very important. But we haven't perfected that. um, when we talk about a Taiwan contingency in the past,
Mhm.
it was really limited to the Taiwan Strait. That's changed with the Ukraine war. And if you remember back in February 2022, when Putin went to Beijing on the eve of the Winter Olympics, and they signed the 9-page communique, there's basically a quid pro quo in that uh, that in the future Russia will recognize, well, it actually does recognize China's claims on Taiwan. So basically, it's going to turn a blind eye to when China does launch an attack on Taiwan, which
So,
isn't an if but a when. So you've gone to a two front war now, and then if you include North Korea in that, operating in the Sea of Japan, now you have a three front war, and then uh, in the South China Seas you'll have a four front war. Not to mention all the chaos that China or Chinese overseas in the BRI regions, they can cause a lot of chaos there that will cause countries to have to focus on domestic disruption. Um, so y- you have to look at it, geostrategically, and not just the capability issue.
no, I mean, I understand why you paint this kind of a picture, and if I get your point correctly, it's more a question of when. It's not a question of if. And sadly, I don't see US really responding to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, whatever variety that invasion falls into. John, would you agree to that?
Well, there are clear concerns among not just in the Philippines, but also in Japan and even eventually South Korea regarding the level of commitment, of course, when it comes to the security front. If you look into Korea in the West Sea, earlier this year, China has begun to emulate, for instance, what it is doing in the South China Sea when it comes to building solid structures in disputed areas. And we see that earlier this year with Korea. And clearly, when we look into the South China Sea issue, for the Philippines, what happens to our north, right, above and beyond the Luzon Strait, is of equal importance to our national security calculations, and therefore our Philippine military armed forces of the Philippine chief, General Bronner, clearly stated just a few days ago, that we would need to prepare in terms of Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Critically, because on one hand, we are bound by it in terms of geography. Second would be, of course, the commitments within the mutual defense treaty. And third would be the presence of over 200,000 overseas Filipino workers in Taiwan. So, therefore, when it comes to planning, in the past 2 years alone has witnessed a number of expansive activities that were largely focused on securing the northern borders of the Philippines along with the adjacent waters. So we look into the expansion of EDCA bases to the north. We also look into the creation of the Philippine Coast Guard station in Batanes, the northern province of Batanes. We also see, based on the visit of Secretary Hegseth and his joint statement with the Philippine National Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro, that there would be advanced joint operations also in Batanes. If we look into the Balikatan exercises since 2022, which is the annual Philippine-U.S. military exercise, and of course with the incorporation of Australia, and this year Japan would be joining in for the first time. We are seeing a clear focus on not just the western section, but also the northern section, where while we were focused on the deployment of the Typhoon mid-range weapon systems, which are also conveniently positioned in the north, the United States would bring in the Nemesis weapon system, which is also critical in targeting moving maritime objects within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. So, therefore, we can clearly see that there is this raised awareness in Manila regarding the need to prepare. And I agree with Dr. Eldridge. Whether it's no longer a question of whether or not the United States would do something about it. In the Philippines, we're also deliberating on, how particularly this would play eventually in the long term, and if the situation continues to overstretch, and what role the Philippines will play in this. And of course, we are looking into the political calculations as well of our partners such as Japan and Australia. So, well, Australia to a lesser extent. But clearly, when we talk about Taiwan, the major concerns are situated within the first island chain. And therefore, if China becomes successful in breaking through Taiwan, then eventually it will become more complicated for the Philippines to secure our other maritime zones. And this is an inevitable consequence if China is successful with Taiwan. It would be much more difficult to compromise. And therefore, the Philippines, along with the United States recently, and of course, working with our like minded partners, we all focus on the concept of peace through strength. And therefore, the visit of Secretary Hegseth also complemented this ideal by putting much emphasis on physical deterrence, which is something that resonates well in Manila. But of course, when you're asking about the concerns, yes, there are, especially since the military drills of China, the PLA, have actually been inching closer and closer to the main island of Taiwan, and of course the other islands. So in that regard, there's that realization that it is a matter of time, because for those that argue that gray zone will continue and persist as gray zone, well, there is always a limit to the use of gray zone before it turns kinetic. And therefore, it's a matter of time that this happens, especially as China becomes more and more, I'd like to say, frustrated with the regional situation. So, in that regard, we see it involving the Russians, North Koreans more. So, it's a matter of time, and preparedness becomes a critical issue.
No, I'm glad you mentioned the gray zone, because what we have now been seeing is that, well, I mean, at least in the Russia-Ukraine theater, in the European theater, we got a first-hand experience with seeing how actually the conventional warfare is complemented by all kinds of hybrid warfare as well, and that's precisely what we are fearing in the Indo-Pacific domain, because Indo-Pacific, and here I would like to have a little bit of a discussion on the nature of the security theater or the challenges that we have in this big, huge maritime theater. Unlike the European context, the Indo-Pacific doesn't have a NATO, doesn't have an Article 5. And I'm not even getting into how effective is NATO or Article 5 under Donald Trump. That's a different discussion for a different day. Just coming back to the nature of the Indo-Pacific, maritime theater per se, which is like this vast maritime region. It doesn't have a well formulated Article 5 collective security, etc. It is a rather complex theater, because you are in the middle of that. The Southeast Asian nations do not want to take sides. Most of the countries in the region do not wish to take sides and wish to reduce the great power contestation by way of third ways. France talks about it, of course India also talks about it, European Union talks about it. But from what I just understand from what Dr. Eldridge has been, explaining to us all this while, is that China's invasion of Taiwan is a matter of when, not if. And in that situation, where do you think the gray zone is going to play a role in worsening the conventional war whenever it starts? How do you think this plays out? First to you, Robert, and then of course I'm going to ask the same question to Don.
Yeah, so the so-called gray zone is actually in many ways, well, warfare itself. We're already essentially at war. 10 years ago at this time, in it was in March of 2015. Uh, I attended a meeting with the senior U.S. and Japanese leadership, military leadership in Okinawa.
Okay.
And at that time, the head of one of the branches of the Japanese military mentioned to the uh, 3-star U.S. Marine Corps general. He said, General, we're already at war now with China. And basically, he was explaining how, the information operations that China was, using against Japan was essentially the beginning of a wartime effort. And he was very correct in saying that. China's been practicing, political warfare on Japan for the past 70 years, as it has, vis-a-vis Taiwan and whatnot. So, unfortunately, in a lot of countries, Japan included, they've become numb to it, accepting of it. And then add to that economic warfare, add to that lawfare, and particularly the Philippines experiences a lot of the lawfare. All of these actions, activities make the populace, numb to the situation. So, in one sense, that's very concerning. Another thing about the laydown of the region, and the big difference between Ukraine and a Taiwan situation, as everybody would, immediately recognize, is the geographic differences. Taiwan is an independent island, whereas Ukraine is surrounded by countries, and which is, quite good when you have allies or friends right next to you. Your population could evacuate. Your, non-combatants can evacuate. You can get supplies in very easy. That's how Ukraine was able to sustain itself for this long. You don't have that situation with Taiwan. Nobody can leave there in a contingency. Don mentioned earlier the 200,000 Filipinos that are living and working in Taiwan. There's even more Indonesians, and the Indian presence is relatively small, but there's a concern about that. There are no evacuation plans for the foreign residents of any country in Taiwan. And nobody wants to talk about it because it's politically not expedient to do that. And before I left Taiwan, I tried to create a project that would look at it on a track 2 level. Nobody even wanted to talk about it at a track 2 level, a non-official level, let alone at a track 1 or a track 1.5. So people are even afraid to talk about these kind of situations.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other big distinction between Ukraine and Taiwan is that the international community recognizes Ukraine, whereas for the most part, the international community doesn't recognize Taiwan. Only 12 countries internationally recognize Taiwan, and none of them, with all due respect to those 12 countries, have any political, economic, or military might to do anything. They're not even a speed bump in international politics. They're they're like a puddle in the roadway for China. And so it's going to be an ugly situation, and China's going to want to act sooner rather than later.
No, interesting. You mentioned that. In fact, just as you were mentioning about how many countries have really recognized Taiwan as a country, and I think the latest case in point is that when Donald Trump was announcing the reciprocal tariffs on Liberation Day, and when you saw as to how has he calculated all the reciprocal tariffs in the list, it had said country, and Taiwan was listed as a country, and I think it caught a lot of people's attentions. So anyway, but that remains to be seen. But coming back to the original question, Don, I mean, it's the same thing, right? I mean, going by how Beijing has just unveiled its cutting capabilities, right? I mean, why would Beijing talk about cutting cables when it doesn't if it doesn't intend to do that? And that also gives us an understanding that the intensification that we see of Chinese air and naval activities around the island means that the Chinese are in a position to rapidly switch from the gray zone to a genuine blockade or an invasion. And in that situation, how do you see this unfolding? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, clearly, yes. I think that China does have the intent, and it has been determined to, at least achieve the level of capabilities needed to pursue such operations in the near future. But of course, how this would play out would be a subject of, it will depend on which actors would eventually be involved, at least for the short to midterm and the midterm to long term. But again, on one hand, we should not over exaggerate the military might of China. And I say this again and again, given that, first of all, we have to be prudent. I mean, the last war that it fought, it pretty much lost as well. And it does not really have the battle experience, particularly in such a level of, the critical nature of the assault would be amphibious in nature, and it would be much more difficult than, for instance, what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So, of course, there are concerns over logistical supplies, etc. And this is why China has been becoming, it has been more aware and more attentive to these logistical elements. And you've talked about the cable cutting, announcement, for instance, the capability. These are, of course, all in line with making sure that the PLA would have at least the upper hand in paralyzing critical infrastructure, communication, which would eventually be very conducive for such an invasion over, as Dr. Eldridge had said, an independent island. There is, of course, at the crux of it, not, that really hasn't been in that position to talk about what happens after, right? So along with the diaspora and the communities there as well. So in that regard, it would definitely be a devastating issue. And circling back to the initial question that you've asked about the gray zone aspect, when we talk about the Philippine experience, we are one of the most targeted states, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in the world when it comes to China's gray zone operations. But however, we see that the level of intensity of China's gray zone activities have actually heightened in the last 2 years alone. And therefore, there are concerns whether, not just in Taiwan, but whether this may eventually become kinetic here, where one of the Indo-PACOM reports in 2023 highlighted this risk when we talk about one of the key features in the West Philippine Sea, the Ayungin, or the Second Thomas Shoal, which for the past since 2022 to 2023 had the makings of being a clear target, a clear flashpoint for a potential kinetic engagement between China and the Philippines. But today we look at other features that have eventually garnered such characteristics as well, such as the Sabina or the Espada Shoal. And clearly we see that China has the luxury of picking and choosing targets and sort of mixing and matching its operations based on the level of risk that it is achieving or that it is feeling in that particular area. So one of the reasons why we are witnessing a decrease in provocations in the Second Thomas Shoal, maybe because of the heightened concerns for miscalculation that China is also witnessing there. So it has taken the fight elsewhere in the Sabina and the Scarborough Shoal, or the Bajo de Masinloc. So in that regard, we see that China is still in that position where it wants to enjoy the benefits of its gray zone activities, since it has been quite successful. If we look at it since the 1990s, where deception played a huge role in taking over key features such as the mischief reef, which is well within our exclusive economic zone, but it has become a full fledged offshore military base with critical offensive capabilities right at our necks. So, this is why I say that this is an existential issue for us and not just a mere security threat.
Right, right. I mean, I'm glad we're mentioning so much about the gray zone, because often we are mostly only discussing about what has been the military modernization, which obviously is a factor, but that doesn't make sense alone or in isolation unless you put together these elements. But also that brings me to the question of disruptive technology and the use of these kind of technologies in the region, because one of the problems with the Indo-Pacific theater is that countries in the region are extremely vulnerable to the ills of disruptive technology, and I think China is knows that really well and exploits it to its advantage. Robert, would you like to share something about that?
Yeah, and I would say not just China, but Russia, North Korea as well. So for years and years, vis-a-vis Japan, there have been numerous, spying efforts, infiltration efforts. You're familiar with the kidnapping of Japanese citizens.
Of course.
Um, and now, over the past 5 or 6 years, you could say that Japan's borders are very porous. There are a lot more foreigners that are relocating to Japan, and they've been able to really get a toehold or a grip on key properties in Japan, close to important infrastructure.
Hmm.
Um, and so not only the technologies, but the um, but everyday activities that can disrupt, uh, normal Japanese life, or Japanese responses in a potential, contingency. Um, Last year, when I was living in Taiwan, on April 3rd, there was a large earthquake on the eastern coast of the Philippines. I'm sorry, of Taiwan. That day, I happened to be back in Japan, and later that day, I was riding on the bullet train, and I was thinking, if if there were a contingency in Taiwan and Japan and China wanted to neutralize Japan, it could just wreak havoc on its infrastructure. And it wouldn't even have to do an attack on a military base per se. It could take out just one Shinkansen or bullet train would basically lock down all of the bullet trains that are running from you know east to west, and each bullet train has about 1,000 people on it easily. So 50, 60, 70 trains would be essentially locked down or shut down. It could do a strike on a major um, train terminal, train station. Um, it could use cyber warfare and shut down the airports uh, or the ports. So there's so much disruption that can take place that it is non-military in nature. And I don't think uh, Japan is adequate, or really any country is adequately prepared, for that. Um, and so the dialogues between countries that are vulnerable to China, uh, really need to step up, and the technologies to counter that are increasingly important. In an earlier question, you asked about, or you mentioned about the fact that uh, the Indo-Pacific region doesn't have a NATO-like structure. Um, and if you think about the so-called U.S. hub and spokes, approach to the region, um, most of the alliances between the United States and the other country were created in response to Japan, reemerging or returning to international society after the end of the Allied occupation in 1952. So the Philippines, the ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, whatnot. These countries were afraid of Japan becoming independent again, and so you can argue that it was a negative reactionary approach to alliances, certainly not a proactive one. It was defensive vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the PRC, but it was also defensive against Japan. We need to upgrade these alliances so that they embrace one another and embrace Japan.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, we're in the last century as far as alliance structures go.
No, well, I do get that point, and like a couple of more things on. I mean, I would like to pick your brains on, which is that we keep hearing about AUKUS, we keep hearing about GCAP, for example, right? Where do you think is the potency of these kind of initiatives to try and preserve the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, if I may call that?
Well, it really depends on the level of like openness that they are. So, AUKUS is great, but it doesn't include Japan, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or if you look at, all the different dialogues that are going on, extremely important. However, there's a huge, it's like a big donut when we talk about all these different dialogues, like, Japan, the United States, and the Philippines, or Japan, the United States, and Korea. Everything's good. Go for it. But Taiwan is missing from everything. Taiwan does not show up on anybody's, framework for dialogue. And so we're avoiding talking about the most important issue. And until that takes place, China's at an advantage. And
Well, China
again,
does seem.
yeah, they're going to move
Yeah.
before the framework is created, I think.
Well, China does have an advantage, and I frankly, most of these discussions actually lead us to the same question, which is that what really is China waiting for? Because everything seems to be working in their favor. There is a United States which has a very different view of its allies. You also mentioned the capabilities issue. You mentioned, that perhaps the authoritarian regimes tend to think of leaving a legacy instead of any other rational, choice theory. But then I have a question specifically for Don, which is, and I know that he's been working a lot on the trilateral framework. Don, what do you think is the potency of the trilateral framework in the larger security architecture for the Indo-Pacific?
Well, if you think about the trilateral, and if I may, extend it to what we call today as the Squad, it is, of course, important when it comes to positioning Philippine interests in the broader region. Of course, this allows us to create the right conditions to improve our military capabilities, our technological capabilities, where we lag behind, but also improve interoperability and preparedness between and among partners and our treaty ally. So when we talk about its long-term utility, well, the trilateral is not something that is deeply institutionalized to the point that it has a secretariat, etc. It is still pretty much ad hoc, but at the same time, this allows flexibility when it comes to picking areas of great significance to any of the three countries. And if you look into the long-term roadmap, I think it shows some promise, especially when it comes to the economic security dimension of the China challenge. And when it comes to semiconductors, for instance, the Philippines is the second largest producer of nickel right after Indonesia, but 90% of our exports go to China. And we realize that this is, in fact, a critical issue. And therefore, while we do not have the capabilities or the capacity the trilateral serves as an important stepping stone for us to develop that eventually in the long term. By rerouting supply chains and creating more connectivity between and among three countries, and especially capacity building and technological sharing. So, in that regard, we see that the trilateral is not just based on one dimension, but it is multifaceted when it comes to the multi-dimensional threat that China continues to pose for the midterm and the long term. When it comes to the short to midterm, of course, the trilateral, knowing that Japan also has now a reciprocal access agreement with the Philippines, making it more conducive, more efficient in facilitating bilateral military to military cooperation, which oftentimes faces a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. But with the RAA, this allows a more seamless level of coordination between the Philippines and the defense forces of Japan. And pretty much because we have such agreements in place with the United States via the VFA and the status of forces agreement with Australia, it becomes more convenient to discuss and to create areas of cooperation at the operational level. So I think this is one of the reasons why Japan is now part of the Palikatan exercises that will be happening next month, or sorry, this month. When we talk about the joint cooperation, the joint preparedness issue, well, pretty much it's not just about conducting drills and just keeping it up for another day and saying that okay, let's plan it sometime else. It's about creating consistent and continuous collaborations when it comes to the defense establishments of various countries. And with that, you need the legalities in it as well to eliminate extra bureaucratic red tapes to ensure that everything is well functioning and prepared in terms of quick deployments, etc., in times of crisis. And therefore, we are seeing that the trilateral is already emerging, to address this particular limitation that the three countries had in the past few decades. So, of course, we are not exaggerating again its utility, given that there are still several obstacles in mind when it comes to joint preparedness. But we are seeing such a significant leap from where it was even 10 years ago. So clearly, it's about facilitating and maximizing what can be arrangement.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned the trilaterals. Now, quick questions to both of you. I'll start with Robert first. We are discussing this from an Indian perspective as well. I really have to ask you towards the end of our discussion, what role do you see India playing increasingly in this very contested space, this fast evolving space, and also this remilitarization and deglobalization that we are going through? Robert, you first.
Yeah. Um, India is one of the bright spots in this very dark, situation, and uh, I was very, happy and impressed to see India's um, increasingly close ties with the Philippines, and so I'm always impressed with India, and I'm extremely happy about India's greater involvement, with uh, with uh, the Western Pacific or Southeast Asia. Um, that is, it's good for India. It's good for the region. You know, I I have high hopes for that, um, and from a larger international perspective, I think 21st century, could very well be India's century. And so, there's, incredible, human resources, incredible thinking, intellectual power that exists, in India itself, as well as the Indians abroad. So, that's what I'm very excited about. Um, I think India tends to be a voice of reason and
Mhm.
an alternative perspective on events. So yeah, I look forward to that. I also really appreciate the relationship that India and Japan have,
Oh, yes.
both historic as well as contemporary, and particularly in a maritime um, nature. Between the navies, there's certainly a lot of collaboration that can take place. Um, I think the economic relationship is still nascent or emerging, but I think that has enormous potential too.
Right.
I look forward to India's greater involvement and standing internationally.
Well, I mean that's an important part you mentioned. But Don, I mean, of course, you know this very well that India also likes to maintain a kind of a strategic agnosticism when it comes to taking China's name. Right, we would prefer it that way, and often India is also criticized for sort of pulling the Quad framework a little back when it comes to devising anything more tangible in China. Do you agree with that?
Well, one thing is for sure that India is a stabilizing force and will continue to be so as it continues to rise. When we talk about India's strategic culture, of course, and we could have a separate discussion of how many hours when it comes to India's strategic culture. But clearly, when we're looking at contemporary geopolitics, we are seeing a lot of appreciation, particularly from the developing world, towards India's ability to take a stand that may not necessarily be considered mainstream or considered to be one that is either going for one side against the other. And that is because India is trying to present itself as a rising great power with its own choices to make, and not necessarily a power that would eventually fall into the basket of other powers. And that has been well received, especially in Southeast Asia. If we look into the state of Southeast Asia surveys, the 2025 one that was just published a few days ago, if we look into the perception of Southeast Asian countries when asked who would you pick as an alternative partner amidst the US-China power competition, Japan is number one, and number two is India. And this is, in fact, far greater ranking than countries like South Korea, the United Kingdom, or even Australia. So, and the percentage has actually increased even from last year. So, in this regard, we can clearly see that what India is doing is, in fact, something that is looked up to by countries in the developing world. Because which country would not want to have the capacity to take an independent stand, one that does not necessarily reflect the major power dynamics? And what India it will eventually have to face certain constraints, as it continues to rise and as the structural challenges continue to unfold. But then again, it is showing that there is an option. And India today is very much willing to be an option for many of the developing countries in the Indo-Pacific. And this is, I think, one of the very important attributes that India is illustrating. It is willing to pick up a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a very important point because, yeah, we do, from India's
And
perspective,
in the Philippines, we recognize this and we realize this to the point that the bilateral relationship is witnessing the level of momentum not seen in the past 2 decades.
right. No, I mean, that's an interesting way you put it. And from India's perspective, of course, I mean, when we look at Indo-Pacific and Indo-Pacific being our major, theater, of course, our approach is to always reduce the great power contestation and build collaborative frameworks, not really mutually exclusive frameworks. And that's what precisely India stands for. And I think that's why India enjoys that great reputational advantage, I would say, in countries across the region. But on that note, let me thank you once more for joining me and taking the time out for this very lengthy, extensive discussion on the security scenario in the Indo-Pacific region. Robert, thank you so much for your time. And I have a whole list of books that you have written that I'm going to be putting in the description box for those that would like to read about your work more. Don, of course, is no stranger to Indian strategic circles, and his articles are often referred to by researchers and professors alike. So thank you once again, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very
Thank you very
much.
much.